Hello, my name's Jade and today I'm going to be doing my 2024 wrap up. I'm going to be going over the books. I'm not going to be going over the books I read in 2024, that would take far too long. I'm going to be going over the highlights of the year. I'm going to be reflecting on my goals, talking about how many books I read, how I felt about my reading last year overall, and of course going over the very favourites and the standouts of the year. So last year I read 114 books. I think that's the most books I've ever read in a year, so that's great. And funnily enough, my first goal of last year, I just went back and watched the video where I talked about it last night. And it was to go with the flow more, to have less rigid TBRs, to not really track my reading as much. Like, I didn't want to care about the numbers as much. I feel like I just generally always have this attitude of reading as much as I possibly can. Like, sometimes to the detriment of, like, my own free time, my stress. Like, I almost feel bad about going out and doing things because I'm like, oh, but that's going to put me behind my reading. Yeah, I read the most I've ever read in a year, so that's really interesting. Another goal was to be caught up on all my graphic novel series I'm in the middle of. So Monstrous, Lore Olympus, Something is Killing the Children, and Saga are like the four that I'm really keeping on top of. There's a couple others that like I've technically read the first volume on, but I'm kind of softly DNFing them. I as of right now have no real desire to continue them, or I'm like debating whether or not I do want to continue them. And I did that. I reread the first like 4 or 5 volumes of Monstrous and then caught up with Monstrous. Monstrous was definitely the biggest undertaking, so I've read all 9 of them come the end of last year. I'm up to date with Something's Killing the Children. I think I reread 2 of them as well to like refresh myself on what was happening. A good goal for every year is to be up to date on those 4 series though, because when I get really behind I definitely feel very stressed and like I have to reread everything and I can't remember anything. Reading the entirety of Saga, which I did one year, or rereading the entirety of Monstrous, it's a lot of pressure. I'm very happy with that. Another goal was I wanted to read 1 book by Shakespeare, 1 book by Emma Donoghue, and 1 book by Miriam Toews even, and I did that. I read Haven by Emma Donoghue. I didn't love it, which is very depressing because I love Emma Donoghue, but that's fine. I've read it now. I'm glad to have read it. I read 2 Shakespeare. I read the one with the children, Twelfth Night. The one with the children. I read The Merry Wives of Windsor, and then I read A Complicated Kindness by Miriam Toews, which I also really enjoyed. At the time I kind of felt a little bit underwhelmed by it, but it's really lingered with me, so I think Miriam Toews is definitely up there as a contender for one of my favourite authors, and I liked that goal as a whole, and I think that's something I'm going to be doing, is like read a book by all of these authors, because these are all authors that you want to like read their backlist of and be up to date reading Shakespeare's backlist. I had a goal of wanting to read either 1 or 2 classics to make sure I was still reading classics. And I mean, I obviously did that. I read 2 Shakespeare. I also read The Iliad last year, which was a huge like mashed potato book for me, if you're familiar with Books Unbound. It was a book that I really wanted to read, but I kept putting off because I was so intimidated by it. I really liked the Odyssey. I really like Antiquity and a lot of other Greek works, I suppose. Like, I love Greek mythology, but I do also enjoy reading texts from the time. And the Iliad just really scared me, and I didn't love it. It's just so dense. And I just didn't care about half of what was happening. I think I know the story so well, and I've read so many retellings that in my mind, this is sacrilege, I know, the retellings do it better. I feel like I read a couple others as well, but they're not coming to me off the top of my head, so I'll put any on screen that I also read. And oh yeah, the sequels. This had been an ongoing thing. I had like these 4 sequels one year, and I wanted to either read them all or get rid of them, and I read like 1, so I had a goal to either read or unfold 2 of these 3 sequels. It was The Atlas Paradox, The Eye and the Door, and The Ask and the Answer, and I did that. I read The Atlas Paradox and I unhauled The Ask and the Answer, and I still have The Eye and the Door sitting around. I don't know if I'll ever read The Ask and the Answer. Here's the thing, I'm curious, I want to know what's going on, but it's been so long since I read that first book, and in reality, like, the priority of all the other books I have unread, I just don't see myself getting to it very soon. Who knows? Maybe I'll read it one day and I'll rebuy it and that'll be fine. And then there were some specific books I wanted to read, some specific series I wanted to read, so I'll start with the series because the first one is Monstrous. We've discussed this, I read that. Another one is the Atlas 6 trilogy. I read the Atlas Paradox, as you know, and I also completed it and read the final book, the Atlas Complex. And then I wanted to read The Lord of the Rings, and I didn't do that. I didn't even attempt it. I was never in the mood, and I didn't want to force it because I love the film so much. I feel like this could be a series that I really love, the books. And I think part of the reason why I want to reread it so badly is A, because I feel so behind, B, I now own them physically, and C, I really want to rewatch the films, and I won't let myself do it until I've read the books, because I'm going to want to rewatch the films after I read the books, so I might as well just wait. The mood never struck me, and so I purposefully choose to ignore that one. I think the chances we get into them this year are higher. I started the audiobook for the first one and I've listened to the introduction, and then there are 4 specific books: The Temple of Fortunia by Elodie Harper and Divine Might by Natalie Hayes. Both of these were books that came out in 2022, but I didn't get to them in 2022, so I wanted to read them last year. No, 2023. Jesus, time. It came out in 2023. I didn't get to them, so I wanted to get them in 2024. And I did that very easily. Another one was Hamnet, and I completely forgot this was a book that I wanted to read last year. I read it quite early on in last year. And then the last one was The Children of Dune. Now, this was the one that I had to read. If I read any of them, it was The Children of Dune, because I think by this point it had already been a year since I read Dune Messiah, and so the chances of forgetting everything in the first 2 books is really the precious cooking. And again, I just never felt compelled to. And I made a pact with myself that come November, if I hadn't read it, I'll force myself to read it. But I think there were so many other books on my TBR that I really wanted to read by the end of the year. I could read The Children of Dune, or I could read the stack of books. And I prioritised the stack of books. I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know why I keep putting it off. The longer I've just happened to not read it and happened to not be in the mood of it, the more I'm kind of actively sabotaging myself, because I'm I don't remember anything. I don't even know if they're that good anyway. When I loved the first 2. I feel like I'm never in the mood for sci-fi. I think this is the problem. You can guess what a goal of 2025 is. It's not a goal. I have to. I have to read it in 2025. This is ridiculous. Okay, let's do some honourable mentions, talking about my reading in general. My most common genre is non-fiction, which I found really interesting. I read 19 non-fiction books, and I did have a challenge for myself to read 10 self-help books, and I made a whole video dedicated about that, which I'll link below. I think second to non-fiction was fantasy. I do always feel at the end of the year, when I look back at my reading, I read so eclectically that it's hard to see any pattern or rhyme or reason or any plan. I kind of am feeling going into 2025 that I want to really try and read more fantasy, because although I read a lot of fantasy, there are so many fantasy series that I haven't started that I really want to read, and it's starting to feel a little bit overwhelming, so I think I need to conquer some of them. Are we going to talk about least favourite books? I have 2 least favourite books written down. I want to talk about this very briefly. Neither of them were bad. I feel both of them I gave either a 4 or 5 out of 10. Very rare that I hate a book. These 2 just didn't really vibe with me. One of them was Authority by Jeff Vandermeer. I read the first 2 books in the Annihilation trilogy. This is the second book in the Annihilation trilogy. And I kind of feel the same about both of them, but I think I was more disappointed in this one because I really hoped, because I liked the concept of Annihilation, I just didn't love the way it was executed. And I really hoped this one could be different, and it wasn't. It was just longer. Which made it harder to read, I think. The other one is The Woman Who Ran with the Wolves. I was so looking forward to this one. I'd heard so many good things. It's by far the hardest book I read this year. I had to push myself the most. If I hadn't had that challenge to read 10 books, I would have been very tempted to DNF it, and I don't DNF books. Okay, speaking of non-fiction, I actually have 5 favourite non-fiction books. I guess because I read so many of them, it's got its own little category. So we'll start at number 5. Is it 5 or 6? It's 5. We'll start at number 5 and we'll work our way up. I'll blast through these quickly. At number 5 we have Friendaholic by Elizabeth Day. One is a book in which Elizabeth Day goes back through the friendship she's had over her life, draws conclusions on how she feels about friendship, and also brings in some other studies and statistics. It's really interesting. I flew through it. I thought it was so interesting. We have Divine Might by Natalie Hayes, and in this one it's, I want to say 8 or 7, almost essays on the different goddesses of Greek myth, and just their history and maybe ways we've interpreted them slightly wrong, and the way they're presented throughout time and throughout art and culture. It's almost like a sequel to Pandora's Jar, which is one of, if not my favourite non-fiction book, which does the same thing but with like heroines, just like, not gods. We had A History of the Roman Empire in 21 Women by Emma Southern, which is pretty much what it does on the tin. We look at 21 women throughout the Roman Empire, different like parts, like both geographically and in terms of time period, different status levels. It's a really good variety in there, and we look at those case studies to like learn more about the Roman Empire and about women in the Roman Empire, because women are often neglected. Number 2, we have Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski. If you've watched that video where I go over the self-help books I read last year, you know that I felt very passionately about this. I just think it's a book everyone needs to read. Why don't we know this stuff? And then at number 1, this is a book that I read at the very beginning of the year. We have Witchcraft, A History in 13 Trials by Marianne Gibson. This one wasn't at the bottom of the stack, so I can show it for you. I annotated the living heck out of it, and that wasn't purposeful. I just was so compelled I had to. Again, it says what it does on the tin. We look at 13 different witch trials as case studies to learn more about witches and those time periods in general. I really love learning about history through these case studies. I think it's really important that we remember that people are at the heart of the story, but also through that you can then learn more about the time period, more about attitudes. There are a lot of other things you can learn through that medium. I think she wrote about this with so much dedication and passion. She's very careful with the subject matter. It's clearly something she cares about a lot. It was heartbreaking, but also fascinating, and she brings it again right back from like the demon believing ages all the way up until modern day, and I just learned so much. It was so well written. I flew through it. I was addicted. It was so good. My favourite poetry collection. I read 10 different poetry collections last year. It was another like little mini challenge I set myself, and I'm very glad that I did it. I don't really know exactly what kind of style of poetry I like. I sometimes struggle with poetry, but I know that I want to read more. So I'm glad that I did this. By far my favourite was Brand New Ancients by Kay Tempest. This is kind of like one long poem, kind of narrative. We're following 2 boys who kind of go very different routes in their life. We're all the same as we've always been. Humans have always been this way. We're all gods, we're all special. Like, it's so sad that we're kind of downtrodden. I just thought it was so well done, and I was thoroughly addicted to it. I really cared about the characters. This is one I love to reflect on, like, who did I read the most of, and who were the authors that like really stood out to me? Did I gain any new favourite authors? I don't necessarily know who I read the most of, actually. I'll put it on screen if I can find out. I don't think I like hyper focused on any particular authors this year, apart from maybe the one that I'm about to mention, which is Maggie O'Farrell. I read 3 Maggie O'Farrell books this year, and I adored all of them. I read her non-fiction, I Am. I read Hamnet, obviously, and I read Instructions for Heatwave, and I really want to go through and read everything she's ever read. I read Marriage Portrait by her last year. I read 4 books of her, and her writing is so confident, it's so readable, it's so eloquent, but there's so much in the subtext of it. It's so cleverly done. It's not too flouncy and flowery. Yeah, it is beautiful, but it's still simple and effective. It's just so good. And her characters have all stuck with me so hard. And now we're on to my favourite part of these videos, the favourite books of 2024. I've got 4 honourable mentions. The first one is The Paradise Problem by Christina Lauren. I love Christina Lauren. Their books always make me so happy. I didn't read a ton of rom-coms. I think this might be the only rom-com I read last year, so maybe that's why it stood out to me so much. I just remember having so much fun with it, so much so that I think it's a contender for a new favourite of Christina Lauren for me. At number 3, we have Fourth Ring by Rebecca Yarros. I read the first 2 books, Fourth Ring and Iron Flame, and I just had so much fun with Fourth Ring. Again, it'd been a while since I had so much fun in this way. It almost felt like early days Sarah J Maas, when everything's just like great and Selena's so silly. Again, thoroughly addicted, really enjoyed it, very much looking forward to the rest of the series. Millie Bobby Brown has a quote on the back, I didn't even realise that. Number 2, we have A Complicated Kindness by Miriam Tays. I already mentioned this book in this video. It nearly made the top 10. It didn't quite. There was some shuffling around. It was difficult. And when I first finished it, like, I didn't think it would stick with me. I enjoyed the story. I thought it was well executed. I thought it was well done. I could almost see it becoming like a modern classic. But it has stuck with me. I don't know. I think about the character a lot, which is, I think, the most important part, arguably. And the last one is The Temple of Fortunia by Elodie Harper. Last book in the Wolf Den trilogy, and I didn't love this one as much as I loved the first 2. I was a little bit disappointed by it. But it felt really sad that it didn't make the top 10, because both of the other books did make my top 10. And I did really enjoy it. I thought it was a satisfying conclusion. It's just that it didn't like knock my socks off in the like. The first two really impressed me, whereas this one was just really good, if that makes sense. It's not that this one was really bad in any way, it just didn't have the profound effect on me that the first two did. I'm very satisfied with this as the conclusion to the trilogy. I love this trilogy. I cannot wait for what Elodie writes next. Now we're at the top 10. Exciting. What will they be? I had so much fun coming up with this list. There weren't a load of like really big standout books throughout the year. I tend to get to the end of the year and think that a lot of the books I read were kind of middling. They weren't that great necessarily, but actually I did read a lot of really good books this year. Like, this list was kind of a struggle to come up with. Like, in terms of the ordering, like, I was able to name like 7 books off the bat. At number 10 we have The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. I'm kind of surprised that this was on this list. Like, I really enjoyed reading it, and there were times where I was like, this could almost be like a 9 out of 10, or this like could be a new favourite, but then I can't remember what it was in the end that made it not feel like that to me. I think it felt too short. I think it felt a little bit rushed. If it had been slower paced, it was a really decadent story. It's historical fiction. We're dealing with magic, but it's very subtle. And there's a lot of like the social classes and a lot of like bigger themes that are poked at. It had such a great atmosphere to it. It almost reminded me of The Night Circus. And The Night Circus feels very slow in its telling, and this one doesn't. It feels like we're kind of skipping over time. And so for me, I think I just needed to luxuriate in it a little bit more. It didn't feel as well fleshed out as it potentially could. It's not that it felt like it went too fast per se, it just felt like purely before the kind of story it is, it would have benefited from going a little bit slower. But clearly it stayed on my mind a hell of a lot because it made the top 10 list, which I really wasn't anticipating picking it up. At number 9 we have Foe by Ian Reid, who you might know from writing I'm Thinking of Ending Things, which I read a couple years ago, maybe last year, and did really enjoy. But this one, I was so addicted. It's about a couple that live in the middle of nowhere. They never get visitors, and a car pulls up to their house and the stranger delivers some news to them. I went into it knowing more than that, and I think because I knew more, it was really predictable what was going to happen. And I wonder if you didn't know that, you wouldn't predict it as easily. I honestly don't know. We watched the film and then my mum was able to guess what was going to happen really easily as well. But even if it is just a little bit predictable, I don't care. Would it have been better if it had that shock value? Yeah, I'm sure it would have. But I was theorising like it was going to keep me alive. Like, drawing conclusions about all the little subtleties, like the chickens mean this and the bugs mean this and this is connected to this and he's thinking this because of this. And I think in a way, knowing, obviously I didn't actually know what was going to happen, but I had a very solid hypothesis. It meant that I could look for the clues and for the whys and for the evidence in a different way. Very short book. I flew through it. I was thinking about it all day, like the 3 days it took me to read it. I just think it was really well executed. It was really well written. It's a fascinating premise. It draws on a lot of bigger questions, and again, it clearly stuck with me because it's in my top 10. At number 8 we have another book that I wasn't predicting to be in my top 10, very similar to The Familiar. I find it kind of felt slightly underwhelmed when I finished it, and again, clearly I can't stop thinking about it because here it is. Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armford. I think this was really well executed. It's a really interesting premise. We're following 2 wives who are married to each other. One of them goes away on an expedition under the sea. She's supposed to go away for like 3 weeks, but then she ends up just like disappearing for 6 months. And when she comes back, she's not quite the same. It's very strange. It's got a very eerie quality. We've flashed between one wife who's looking at her wife who had disappeared and trying to like reconcile with the fact that she's different, and we also flash to the wife who was under the sea while she was under the sea. Again, very similar to The Familiar and also Foe. All of these had really solid atmospheres and just tones. The writing was really well done, really thought-provoking. I really came to feel things for these characters. I remember finishing with such a jumble of emotions. I didn't know what to think or feel. I think because it had so much hype and I was expecting to out and out love it and for it to be like one of my absolute top 10 favourites, I kind of felt a little bit underwhelmed because it didn't do that for me. It was missing that like wow factor. I still think it was really well done. And it has lingered on my mind a hell of a lot. I do think about it a lot. At number 7 we have Song of the Huntress by Lucy Holland. Lucy Holland wrote Sister Song, which I read maybe a couple years back whenever it came out, and I really enjoyed Sister Song. And I think they're probably like for like in terms of quality. This one is in the same world, just like later in time. It's very difficult to describe plot-wise. 60 CE England. Christianity, I think, is pretty much instilled. I think the old religion is like looked at as barbarism by this point. And we're following 3 different characters. and the way they're interconnected. There's a king and a queen, and then more of like an outcast figure. And there is magic, and it's kind of very much tied into like old British folklore and old British like pagan religion, and also there's a lot of naturalism linked in with the magic system. The reason it's here on this list, I was obsessed with it while I was reading it, and again, I don't think it's necessarily because it's a better quality or better story than Sister Song or anything like that. I was just so obsessed with our characters. The relationship in here is very confusing. We have like a married couple. The man is questioning why he is the way that he is, and then our wife is very intrigued by this third party, and it makes for a very complicated relationship dynamic. And I was just obsessed with all three of them. I cared about all three of them so much. I'm so passionate about them that even all these months later, it's made my favourites list just because of how much I love them. I think it's also like a great book. If nothing else, it would be on my like honourable mentions. I think the story's really exciting and interesting. It's told very well. I listened to the audiobook, and the audiobook was very well done. At number 6, we have Better by Far by Hazel Hayes. Her debut is Out of Love, and I'm pretty sure Out of Love made my favourites list whatever year I read that one as well. Following Kate. Kate has recently broken up with her boyfriend Finn. They have like recently moved into this house together. It's a little while until the lease is up, and they can't really afford to buy other places individually, so they decide that they're going to do like a 1 week on 1 week off situation. Kate will have the house for a week, then Finn will have the house for a week, and so on and so forth, while she kind of mourns her old relationship. Her books are just so well written. They have a Sally Rooney-esque quality to them to me, and I don't really know what it is, but I feel it. They have a very literary feeling. Both of them have like, think about family dynamics and mental health a lot as well. It's not just about the romantic relationship, but it does obviously dwell a lot on the romantic relationship. Really interesting and thought-provoking ways. The amount of times like I had to underline things because it was so beautifully written, or I related to it so hard, or it was so heartbreaking. They're just fantastically well written. I love her voice so much. There are so many like little human truths, as I like to think of them, that like I think we can all connect to, and she just words it in such a wonderful way. They're so full of heart and feeling and emotion. They make me think so much, and they're just beautiful little works of art, I think, her books. I do think I prefer Out of Love to this one a little bit, which is why this one is slightly lower on the list. It made me feel many an emotion. At number 5, we have Babylonia by Costanza Casati, who wrote Clytemnestra either last year or the year before, and again, that one made my favourites list. Really adored it. Look at all these like new favourite authors I'm collecting. This is great. So this one, we're following, I forget her name, I'm not going to be able to pronounce it. She was like a real figure during this time. It's set in the ancient Near East. A lot of conflict during this time, as you can expect. We are following a girl who's raised in a village. She's not treated very well by her father. She was adopted, she was kind of found in the middle of nowhere. He kept her on, and he's just kind of really waiting to sell her off for marriage. We also follow the king of this land and his best friend, who's kind of second in command almost, and she kind of gets tied up in them and their dynamic, and they have a very complicated dynamic. It's very similar in the way that Song of the Huntress has a complicated dynamic. Very complicated dynamic. Very, very similar to Song of the Huntress. I was obsessed with these characters. I cared so deeply for all of them, and their very painful, very difficult situations. This one's told over a bigger scope of time. The setting is so rich. I was so in that world, and I found it so vivid and interesting. I've never read anything set in this time period, and I really want to, with this location, I suppose. All of the characters felt so real, like I could see all of their psychology working, and I could understand why they did each and everything that they did, as frustrating as it could be. I was so invested in this story. It was interesting and unique and painful, and the way it looks at war is really honest. It kind of reminded me of Pat Barker in that sense, that it's not glorified in any way. It really looks at the horrors of war. I was really obsessed with it. By Cassandra Clare. This is another wild card. I kind of felt like it would be in the list. I knew that because of how obsessed I was while I was reading it, but I didn't expect it to be so high. Again, I was just completely obsessed with it when I was reading it. I went away for a weekend in the midst of reading it, and it's like a tome, so I couldn't bring it with me, and the whole time I could not stop thinking about it. I missed it so much. So this is Cassandra Clare's adult debut. It's the start of a new series, high fantasy, where I feel like the city's called Castlane. Ooh. We have like very much a political landscape going on. It is one of those. We're in a kind of urban city setting, but it's a very fantastical, interesting, lush. Following two characters. One is the sword catcher to the crown prince of this land. Basically, he looks just like him, and his job is to protect him with his life. Literally, like, if he's about to go get stabbed, he has to catch the sword. That's where sword catcher comes in. And then we're also following Lynn, who is a healer in this land, and these healers kind of almost tap into magic, and they're kind of outcasts. They have to stay in their own little segregated area, and things start going awry. It's very subtle, it's very slow, not a ton happens. It does have quite an explosive end, and there are like some action bits, so it's not that it's boring and slow and nothing happens. It is just slow, like in terms of the grander scheme of thing, in terms of like the plot, what's actually going on. We have these tiny little seeds and acorns and threads opening for what might come. It's unclear as to what the series as a whole is going to be about necessarily, and what our biggest thing is going to be here, but we have some little nubbins. I'm not sure how they connect to each other, and I'm worried that they'll get lost along the way because they're so subtle, but I just have to put faith in Cassie Clare because I know that's something she does very well, like the mystery element and threading things to come together. If it does that, this is going to be such a good series. I loved the way it was written. I loved spending time in this world. I loved the magic system in the world so much. I felt really invested in the characters. I was theorizing like a madwoman. I cannot wait for the next book in this series. It's probably my most anticipated release of next year. We're into the top 3. At number 3 we have Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. Now this one and number 2 I feel like are tied. I feel like you could swap this and have this at number 2 and I'd also be okay. This is just the number I have it written down. Sally Rooney is very well known. She's coveted for her blunt yet interesting and clever being the key word, her writing style. She's kind of more like people either love her or hate her. I honestly don't know too much about the reception of this one. I think some people I do know covet it as her best book, which I'm hesitant to say, but I do think it's really up there. It's hard because I also just truly love Conversations with Friends and Normal People, so I feel like this comes after those two for me, but then I could easily reread them and change my mind. I feel like the plot in this one, where it's longer, is a little bit looser, and I think it's well done. I don't think it needs to be shorter per se. I just love the blunt impact that the other two have. I think they're real like masters of control. In this one we're following two brothers who recently lost their father, and we're looking at how grief impacts them and their relationship. They're both dealing with age gap relationships and kind of taboo relationship. The older brother has an ex-girlfriend from many years ago who he's very close with, and he's also dating someone younger than him. And then the younger brother meets an older woman and they start a new relationship. Obviously well executed. The way grief is explored is so subtle, but it speaks volumes. You can't ignore it, and the way it builds is so well done. The pacing and the scope of it is so clever. I was just again obsessed with it while I was reading it. I was underlining so many lines because I resonated with them. Very similar to Hazel Hayes. This is why I think they feel similar to me. They just both speak about these human truths and these human emotions and these things that we all know and feel, but they put it in words that make us recognize it and value it in a way we hadn't before. It made me feel the emotions. It was masterfully written. I loved the characters. I loved spending time with them. I was mourning the loss of them as soon as I finished it. If that's not a good book, I don't know what is. See, now I'm kind of wondering if Intermezzo should be number 2, and I just kind of jumped the gun with this one. But we'll say they're neck and neck, and we'll leave it as it is. At number 2, we have Instructions for a Heatwave by Maggie O'Farrell. I read this in the summer, maybe June, July, and the characters have haunted me ever since. I cannot stop thinking about them. We're following a family. July 1976, and London is in the grip of a heat wave. Robert Rowden tells his wife Greta that he's going around the corner to buy a newspaper. He doesn't come back. We're following his wife Greta and his kids, predominantly the kids, I think. So there's a son and 2 daughters. One of them has moved to America. She has to fly back. And they're all in very different stages of their lives. And there's like history between them. And they all have to come home to try and figure out what's happened to the dad. So we have the mystery of like where's dad gone? What's happened to him? And that is like a very real mystery within the book. But then we're also looking at all 3 of these characters, like the pasts between them. Like the 2 sisters have had like a little falling out, and then also where they're at in their lives, how they got to this place, how they feel about this place. We're just really dissecting it all again in this very subtle literary way. I loved that exploration. They're all in such different places. It brought up so many interesting questions and themes. Felt for all of them so hard. Again, I understood their psychology so well. It's like they were real people. It's expertly written. I mean, I went on a rant earlier about how good her writing is, so I'm gonna try and rein it in a little bit. I think it's such a fantastic concept. I think It's explored really delicately and intricately, yet so in depth. My favourite book of 2024 is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. I read Twelfth Night after finishing this because I had such a bad book breakup. I needed something to fill the void, and I was like, what can I read? What will feel the same? I know, let's go back to the source material. This is when I read I Am by Maggie O'Farrell, because again, I needed a fix. I was so obsessed with it. Nothing would be as good, and I knew that very wholeheartedly. Without a doubt, my favourite book of the year. I read it really early in the year as well, and it stayed with me throughout the whole year, and it's a new all-time favourite. It's 10 out of 10, God tier level. Following Shakespeare's family, mainly his wife, but we do spend a lot of time with Shakespeare himself and the kids. Shakespeare had 3 children. He had an older daughter, Susanna, and then Judith and Hamnet were twins. Hamnet dies. It's said at the very beginning of the book. This isn't a spoiler. And we're looking at the impact his death has on the family. It's so masterfully done. I, again, could feel these characters' psychology. They felt so real to me. I cared about them. I cared about Agnes the most. And I do think her heart is the driving force of the novel in some ways. It wrecked me. It was so well written. I couldn't stop then obsessing about Shakespeare. I had a very Shakespeare feeling year. I ended up going to Stratford-upon-Avon because I was so obsessed. I needed to see where this book was set, essentially. Such a complicated situation. It makes you think about so many different things. There are a lot of different themes and kind of ideas of the time in here. I just love it so much with my whole heart. And that's all there is to it. So those are my favourite books of 2024. I'd love to hear what your favourite books of 2024 are below. I think I've blabbed on enough for one video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing morning, afternoon / night. My name's Jade. I hope I see you again next time. Goodbye!